Modern pirates are well known for using small motorboats to speedily capture large cargo vessels, and the problem isn't exactly new. Pirates have always operated from tiny vessels, rowboats and such, and they were surprisingly crucial to naval doctrine. Few are the paintings of sea battles not featuring rowboats, often as a focal point. For a pirate, small watercraft are cheap, fast, and stealthy, can and could capture larger ships with surprising efficacy. We have depictions of these tiny vessels manned by pirates and going up against full-rigged merchantmen. Now imagine what a swarm could do. Ubiquitous to the Caribbean was the dugout canoe. Carved from a single tree, this ancient vessel was the most common type within the tropical basin. They were used for everything: fishing, trade, and piracy. As a pirate vessel, canoes were cheap, portable, and fast. Most often used in conjunction with a larger vessel, canoes could be deployed all on their lonesome, and to surprising, terrifying effect, but not without considerable risk. Usage and utility of the canoe was entirely based on their construction, and understanding it is vital to understanding the canoe. Canoes have a long, international history. They were a common sight in ancient Europe, but were abandoned by the West in the early Middle Ages, replaced by a variety of small rowboats, only to be adopted on an unprecedented scale by colonists moving to the New World. This was a result of native traditions and technology, merging with European demand and inventions. The canoe has been with the Native Americans for thousands of years. They've been sighted from the icy Arctic down to the Straits of Magellan, owing to the simplicity of their design. They served to connect the isolated Caribbean islands, creating communities that were surprisingly interactive. The canoe was absolutely essential for the economic life of pre-Columbian civilization, as it would be for the early colonial communities. Pirates, as well as settlers, planters, and merchants, all depended on canoes in a wild terrain without roads or railways, where the most efficient transport was on rivers and coasts, and building materials were scarce. Let's start from the beginning. The construction of a canoe began with the materials. Most important was the tree, which would form the body of the canoe. They were carved from a single log. The tree had to be sufficiently tall, wide, straight, and also be accessible for easy transport to the coast. Its size determined the size of the canoe. Some canoes were so large as to be turned into small ships, but these kinds of vessels were used differently from the small boats and canoes, and will be tackled in a future episode. Absolutely crucial was the type of wood. Native Americans preferred the silk cotton tree, Ceiba pentandra, since it was big and tall, even exceeding European oak. It could reach up to 70 meters, with a long and straight trunk. The wood itself was soft and spongy, its low density making it easy to work with and swift on the sea. Think like a cork. But it also made it susceptible to the wood-eating mollusks of the tropical sea, teredos. An alternative, often preferred by Europeans, was the red Caribbean cedar, Cedrela odorata. Lighter than oak and still good for speed, its high content of resin made it taste unappealing to maritime bugs. I actually keep a few cedar blocks in my closets to keep bugs away from my clothes. They don't like the smell. I think it's nice. Felling the trees was usually done with stone tools. Some would also light a fire at the base of the tree to burn it loose. Columbus as physician commended the beauty of these stone tools, described in detail by the Buccaneer Dampier, but the metal ones introduced by Europeans were simply more efficient. Many were sold to native groups allied to Europeans, like the Mosquitoes, but many continued the use of stone tools. Bigger trees thrived in the highland rainforests, whereas smaller ones grew along the coast. This made it highly dangerous to transport the bigger logs, both owing to the weight and the hard terrain, like a steep slope. The surface was cleared of branches and bark, the upper surface hewed, and the inside of the log made hollow by digging out the wood, hence why they're called dugout canoes. It all makes sense. This was traditionally done with shell gouges, and especially fire. A fire was lit on the top, the burned areas continually scraped, until it had turned most of the inside into ashes. William Dampier referred to these canoes as crudely made, and inferior to those made by metal tools, who didn't use fire even for the digging. Meanwhile, the outer shell was shaped into a preferred form. On the eastern seaboard of the modern United States, natives deployed box-shaped canoes with flat bottoms, bows, and sterns. When Barbadian settlers moved to Carolina in 1670, they replaced them with the more efficient Caribbean variant. Long, slender, both sides sharp. This minimized drag and made them cut through the water like a dagger. However, since canoes were made by hand, every one of them was slightly different, sometimes radically. They were typically between 1.5 to 10 meters long, and between a half to 2 meters broad. Even in the Caribbean basin, local designs often varied. Jamaican canoes were described as having a keel, stern, and sternpost, all cut out from the same log. The hull was then set upright on timber supports. It was filled with water and stones, and fires lit on both sides. The resulting steam would soften the wood and widen the boat, with longer timbers placed in the frame to strengthen the hull. The thickness of the hull was gauged by drilling 3 holes in the bottom. These were then plugged up. The bottom had a preferred thickness of 3 inches, the sides 2, and the gunnels 1.5 inches. All of this required significant precision, and canoe building was highly skilled. It needed intimate knowledge of the local area to find suitable trees. Every tree was different, and every boat was custom built, according to the whims, instincts, and experience of the builder. Design work was done by eye and experience, without the use of drawings. To make the hull seaworthy, potential cracks were filled in with caulking, usually made from the fibers of the sea hibiscus, and it might also be painted in a layer of tar, further making it waterproof. The size of the resulting canoe varied. Some were small and could only carry a couple of men, whereas Buccaneer canoes were large enough to carry 15 to 25 men. When the hull had been formed, the builders could look to adding improvements to it. Most important was the mode of propulsion. Canoes were traditionally paddled, and even large canoes could be paddled by a single, standing man. However, paddling was slow and more labor-intensive compared to rowing, which is what Europeans preferred. Rowing was less intensive and also faster, at the cost of being louder, which is why paddling was used in sneak attacks, often at night. Short paddles also allowed canoes to get very near the shore, escaping contrary currents, where they outpaced rowing boats with longer oars, forcing them to remain in deeper water with the strength of the stream against them. To make the canoe friendly to rowing, it also required some modifications. Firstly, oarsmen needed somewhere to sit. Most rudimentary was to add sticks running along the breadth of the canoe. Not too comfortable to sit on, but it would do in a pinch. Better were benches, also called thwarts. Next, they needed somewhere to fix the oars. They would hunt manatees and use the hide to make oarlocks, fixing them to the canoe gunnels and tying the oars to them. This also made the rowing more silent than using iron tholes. Silence was especially useful when hunting manatee, who had poor eyesight but good hearing. The oars themselves were typically made from lancewood or white mangrove. Steering the canoe was traditionally done with a steering paddle. This required a lot of skill. The steersman had to sit on the edge of the canoe astern, one hand on the end of the paddle, the other hand on the loom just above the blade. He would either use his hip or the very stern as a pivot, which was crucial in swift water. It was very intensive, and some preferred to add a rudder instead, steering it from a tiller. Sailing was an alternate mode of propulsion. It was common on larger canoes, but even the very small ones, to add a single collapsible mast. It could then be raised when there was a good wind, and lowered when there was none, in order to prevent drag, or when rowing against the wind. Cordage was usually made domestically from the sea hibiscus. Sail and mast did come with the risk of capsizing in a stiff wind, especially since canoes weren't especially stable. They required ballast, and in the Pacific Ocean, they had outriggers added for increased stability. These prevented rowing, however. The rig of the canoe could vary immensely. This image, taken from a Caribbean map, shows a canoe rigged with a very typical lateen sail. This type of sail can be used to move in almost any direction of the wind, almost completely against it, but it can also be difficult to handle in rough weather. Note how the sail is stowed, but the mast is still up, indicating that it's not collapsible. The canoe is towed behind a large ship, and used as the ship's boat. This image, also from a Caribbean map, shows a canoe manned by two men, one on the steering paddle, another in the fore. It is mounted with a short mast and a square sail. These types of sails perform best with the wind, and poorly in any other direction, but they are safe and easy to use. The final map image we have shows a canoe rigged with a Bermuda sail. The lower part of the sail is fixed onto a boom attached to the mast, making it the most complicated of the known canoe rigs. It is used in a similar manner to lateen sails, but is more well balanced, easier to handle, and safer, making it suitable for a small canoe operated by just a few people. One of the big advantages of the canoe was their shallow draft. It also made them more susceptible to hard weather and the open ocean. And some pirates would make the canoes more seaworthy by raising the sides, done by nailing additional planks over the gunwales. By tradition, canoes were also richly decorated. Columbus himself documented royal canoes owned by chieftains, decorated at the bow and stern with metal bands and paintings. The smaller ones might have had no decoration at all, or at least simpler ones. Jean-Baptiste Labat documented a Carib canoe, the flat stern of which was decorated by the head of a monkey, crudely carved in bas relief, and near this carving they had fastened a human arm. A French maritime dictionary also mentions how the stern might be painted with what they call grotesques, a fantastical, exaggerated-looking face. It was also common to just paint a canoe. Ravenel de Lussan, a French filibuster, describes to us two different types of canoes used by him and his pirates: canoes for carrying water and canoes for war. These were constructed differently. The water canoes for carrying large barrels, and the canoes of war, presumably, for transportation, boarding combat, pursuit, war, basically. The water canoes had to be built more deep and broad, allowing them to hold more cargo and do so stably. The war canoes had a significant length-to-breadth ratio, sharp at both ends, and prioritized speed and maneuverability. One of the big benefits of a canoe was the cost, or the lack of it. With most of the Caribbean being untamed and unsettled, you could just go into the woods and cut down a tree. Canoes required no ironwork whatsoever, one of the more expensive components of colonial shipbuilding. All of the materials could be harvested locally, with the only cost being incurred by time and labor. The cutting alone could be time-consuming. Some of the best woodcutters that pirates had were the baymen, Buccaneers who had retired as lumberjacks in Mexico. Dampier mentions how 6 of them were deployed for cutting a tree in the canoe-making process. The tree had a circumference of 18 feet, and by working 3 men at a time, it took the baymen 1.5 days to cut it down, and it seems like it took them at most 5.5 days to carve the canoe. Labat hired 2 men to construct a 31-foot-long canoe, taking them 15 days. It might take longer for indigenous people. They believed that spirits lived in the tree, and would only harvest it between March and May, when the tree shed its leaves and the spirits left it. Canoes were one of the few boats that pirates could feasibly construct themselves, making it excellent for a crew of scalawags just getting started, or one marooned on a desolate island. If they didn't have the patience, canoes could be gifted from allied Native Americans, or purchased. Indeed, canoes would seldom live longer than 10 years, and there was a significant market for their production, both by natives and settlers. Pirates might also elect to steal them, because, you know. Bloody pirates! The dugout canoe was the most common vessel in the American continent. Regardless of ethnicity or nationality, from north to south, the canoe was used for fishing, transportation, trade, hunting, and warfare. It was valued for its cost and especially speed. For most mariners, pirates or not, the canoe served as an auxiliary vessel to proper ships. They could be carried upon the deck of the ship itself or towed astern. During a storm, it was common to take the boat in, and during combat you would tow it astern to clear the ship for combat. If the ship desperately needed speed, the canoe might be let go. A new one would then have to be acquired or purchased. Canoes were used for a variety of purposes. They were used for transportation between a ship and land. Here they could gather provisions, wood and water, plunder, communicating with other vessels, or recover lost anchors and men fallen overboard. They were likewise used during ship battles, same as any rowboat. Whilst the flagship duked it out with cannon and musket, a boarding party would take to the canoe, row or sail behind the enemy, harass them with muskets, or even climb up and take them in melee. By deploying them in this fashion, canoes were surprisingly difficult to counter, since it was hard to hit them with carriage guns. And carriage guns can only be aimed up and down. The whole ship has to be moved to aim them sideways, and the rapid canoe could easily move from the line of fire. The pirate canoes could be crowded with musketeers that could fire on the gun ports, keeping them shut. Musket volleys were the best way of countering canoes. A good, well-aimed volley could in theory wipe the canoe clean. However, merchant ships seldom had large crews armed with a lot of muskets. Meanwhile, the mass of pirates would fire back at them, with such accuracy and volume as to suppress them. The best counter to canoes were swivel guns. These were flexible, easy to aim, cheap, could be manned by just one or two guys, and if loaded with scattering junk, could wipe out a boat full of pirates in one shot. Enemy swivels and musketeers had to be suppressed. The canoe would then move behind the ship and wedge the rudder to prevent the enemy from moving. Grenades were then thrown over the sides and the pirates climbed up. These tactics seem very reminiscent of those used by modern pirates. Canoes could also serve as tenders for carrying extra provisions. They were excellent for gathering more of them. Among native peoples, each adult man would usually have his own little canoe for hunting and fishing. And these hunters and fishermen would often be found aboard pirate ships, employed as strikers, hunting large maritime beasts like turtles and manatee with spears. The aforementioned baymen of Mexico would also use canoes for hunting. Canoes allowed them to row inland by river and creek, where they would hunt the great herds of cattle. A man laid down along the length of the canoe and rested his musket on the prow. The other men would aim the entire boat at the target in question, because if they would fire at a bull from the sides, it could charge, tackle, and capsize the entire canoe. We can presume that the Buccaneers used the canoe in a similar manner. These were pig and cattle hunters on the island of Hispaniola, who prepared a sea ration akin to modern jerky, called barbecue or boucané. They would also use the canoe for piracy, without even having a proper ship. One of the canoe's biggest advantages lay in the element of surprise and stealth. Canoes could easily be concealed on a shoreline, covered in foliage, the mast lowered. In a creek or river, they could be hidden under the creeping roots of mangroves. When a ship was spotted, the camouflage was shedded, the men pushing the boat into the water. Owing to their speed, they might be able to board the ship before the defenders could even prepare. By attacking at night, the enemy might not detect the canoe with its low profile, especially if they paddled instead of rowed and did not hoist the sail. The prey might mistake them for a fishing boat. One of the most legendary examples comes from the story of Pierre le Grand. He and his tiny crew set out in only a small boat, Not finding any ship, their provisions running low. They eventually encountered a stray galleon and made an oath to take it or die trying. The surgeon decided to drill a hole in the boat, preventing anyone from escaping. With the Spaniards thinking them fishermen, Père and his men were able to climb aboard and storm the great cabin, where they held the captain hostage. He carried the galleon back to France, never returning to the Americas. It is a fascinating story, but it might be nothing more. Many consider it a legend. It does not mean that the canoe was useless. Take for example the Battle of Perico in 1679. A band of buccaneers under Cuna allies had crossed the Darien Isthmus in a fleet of canoes, entering the Bay of Panama. Here they were beset by a fleet of 3 Spanish barks, armed with dozens of men and multiple cannons. The buccaneers were able to win by rowing their canoes against the wind, where the sailship slowed to a lag. They used this advantage, along with their superior accuracy, to outmaneuver and defeat the Spanish barks, but not without heavy casualties. One can imagine that the Spanish cannons would have had a hard time aiming and striking the buccaneer canoes. Some of the buccaneer canoes did sustain hits, but it did take multiple of them to actually sink a single canoe, a testament to their sturdiness. The canoes struck still had enough time to evacuate to other ones before they were abandoned. As for weapons, the buccaneers had no cannons. Canoes could not even carry swivels, leaving them with only muskets and superior marksmanship. During transportation, muskets were lashed together, corked, waxed, and plugged, and placed under the thwarts along the length of the boat. During battle, the muskets were doled out, cleaned, and loaded. Shooters would lie prone along the length of the boat, taking careful aim and trying to get any cover they could. The buccaneers were expert marksmen. This was their key to victory. When the enemy had been sufficiently battered, they closed in, wedged the rudders to prevent enemy escape, and boarded them. However, the Battle of Perico did not occur on the buccaneers' terms. They did not want open engagements with canoes, and they sustained heavy casualties. These were vessels of surprise and transportation. Indeed, most often they used the canoe to transport them to inland targets, which were then assaulted on foot. Even the smaller pirate ships, barks, brigantines, and sloops were too big to travel inland on the rivers and waterways. These could only be accessed by making landfall or going by canoe. Another one of their benefits was the light weight. A canoe could be carried by one or several men on any landmass between another body of water, before embarking again. The greatest of buccaneer chieftains used canoes in this manner in 2 of his campaigns. First, during his assault on Lake Nicaragua, Morgan began his campaign by hiding his ships on the coast, capturing native guides who took him to the mouth of the river San Juan. Proceeding in a fleet of canoes, the pirates entered Lake Nicaragua, where they took the city of Granada entirely by surprise. The sleeping inhabitants did not expect a pirate attack so far inland. In Morgan's final campaign, he wanted to assault the city of Panama, located on the opposite coast of the Darien Isthmus. After taking the island of Santa Catalina and using it as a forward base, Morgan sent a detachment to capture the castle San Lorenzo, located on the mouth of the river Chagres. Having taken the castle, Morgan and his army made landfall, docked their ships under the castle's protection, and proceeded up the river in a fleet of 32 canoes, each one housing 32 men. It was a lot of guys for very small boats. These canoes were narrow abeam and of shallow depth. They were cramped, confining, and after a few days, the men were almost crippled from lying so crowded in them. Indeed, one of the biggest flaws of canoes was how discomforting they were. I spoke before of the Buccaneers' battle in Perico. This expedition sailed from the Caribbean coast in a fleet of 68 canoes, 357 men distributed among them. For weeks they were confined to these tiny vessels, and when they finally captured a bark with a proper deck, they wrote cheerfully of it in their journals, now being able to finally walk around and stretch their legs. In a canoe, there simply wasn't any space for it. Standing up might destabilize it, and one of the Buccaneers, Basil Ringrose, wrote lengthily about the misery of canoe sailing. But if it was so that we were tired in traveling by land before, certainly we were in a worser condition now in our canoes. He describes them having to haul them over stones and bodies of sand, or fallen trees blocking the river. Come nightfall, they were able to make landfall and overnight in small huts they built on the riverside, resting their weary limbs. Then there were the accidents. He described one canoe which was so slenderly built that it struck a heavy rock and broke. His own canoe was 6 inches thick and very resistant, but the added weight made it difficult to row. At one point it was swept ashore by a storm and still managed to survive, but all of the provisions were ruined. Canoes were completely unprotected from the elements. On a larger vessel, you could always go below deck or even rig a sail into a pavilion. In a canoe, there was nothing. Again, Ringrose wrote how his canoe was especially heavy and fell behind the rest of the fleet. In order to catch up, the men had to sleep in it. Only one was able to lie down at a time, all the while it was raining, reducing them to a wet and frigid state. There were no pumps or scuppers in the canoe, meaning that the water had to be bailed out with a bucket. All boats and ships suffered from constant leakage, and canoes were no different. Even though holes and cracks could be plugged and caulked, water could still enter a canoe quite easily since it lay so low in the water, and splashes in the front and back could easily fill it. One solution lay in the construction, shaping the points afore and astern to point slightly up. Even then, water could get inside at some point, and you could expect to do a lot of bailing, and don't even think about getting caught in a storm. Food aboard a ship was notoriously bad. It might be tolerable in a canoe, purely to the fact that they could only travel relatively short distances, meaning that you'd usually carry fresh provisions. Pirates were often supplied with plantains by their native allies. Fruits were undoubtedly common, as were cakes of bread or dumplings called doughboys, cornmeal, and especially the type of smoked meat called barbecue or boucaneer. However, these would all be susceptible to the problems of leakage and water, and were often ruined. They also had to be eaten raw or uncooked, unless if you made landfall to do your eating and cooking, since the canoe did not have a stove. But there is one instance of a shipwrecked survivor, Nathaniel Uring, constructing a small fire hearth in his canoe. He used it for providing heat in the cold and wet, and for cooking provisions. I've also seen some images of natives having fires in their canoes. Canoes were a great starting point. They could easily be acquired or constructed. But for the more ambitious pirates, they were best used to acquire a proper, decked ship, allowing them to travel farther and enter deep oceans. The canoes could still be kept as auxiliary vessels. The canoe was built and used outside of the New World. They appeared in Asia and Africa, regions often visited by pirates. William Dampier spent considerable time in the East Indies, where he encountered a local type of canoe called a proa. It had a sail and was fitted with an outrigger for the sake of stability, and he described them as incredibly rapid. Canoes with outriggers were likewise found on the island of Madagascar. Pirates spent so much time on this island, intermingling and marrying with the locals, that they created a new tribe of half-European, half-natives. These people would go on their own piratical incursions in domestic canoes, likewise making use of sails and outriggers. Very similar to the canoe were European boats built with planking. They were less common in the Caribbean and more so utilized in the Old World, but very much for the same purposes as the New World canoe. Naturally, they were found in the Americas as well, and pirates used them alongside canoes. But a pirate ship might only have 1 or 2 boats and multiple canoes. These boats went by a variety of different names, including gigs, shallops, longboats, pinnaces, and launches. One of the privateers to make the most effective use of them was Woodes Rogers, during his expedition to South America. Large pinnaces with mast and sail were used to pursue targets in lack of a wind or if the big ship just couldn't catch it. These were propelled by oars and even had small artillery pieces mounted in the fore. They were therefore more similar to the large canoes, piraguas and galley-type vessels, which will be discussed in a future episode. If you want to hear more about pirate seacraft, check out this video on the frigate. I also have an entire playlist all about pirate ships.